Welcome to this channel. In this lecture, we will be exploring religious diversity today and how we may respond to this diversity with a focus on exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. This lecture is Religious Diversity and Islam Towards a Framework. In this lecture, we will unpack the notion of religious diversity and its related terms. Our aim is to establish a basic framework that will help us through all the lectures to follow. The key terms that we will discuss are religious diversity, exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. We will focus more specifically on the meaning of and debates around religious pluralism and some of the different criticisms leveled at the pluralistic approach. We will then turn to a number of Muslim perspectives on religious pluralism and religious diversity. Let us begin with the term religious diversity, as it is really the umbrella term for this lecture and the course as a whole. At its most basic, religious diversity is the term used to refer to the existence of a multitude of religious traditions. It is simply a recognition of the fact, that is, the existence of diverse religious traditions in the society, nothing more. Let us now very briefly look at the development of the discourse around religious diversity in the West, just to get a sense of the context for the debates on religious diversity and pluralism that we are interested in this lecture. Let me mention some of the key developments during the 18th and 19th centuries in the West, in particular in Europe. There was proliferation of the writings of European travelers, missionaries, and colonial officials about other peoples, their religions, and cultures around the world. Through these writings, Europeans were becoming familiar with the level of diversity that exists in other parts of the world. This obviously generated increased interest among Europeans in other cultures and religions. As part of this, we see an interest among some European philosophers and theologians and how to account for this diversity. All of this led to greater curiosity about religious diversity in Europe. Even though there was this sense of religious diversity, given that European states were Christian, in the hierarchy of religions, Christianity was always at the top. This is a very hierarchical view of religions, with Christianity at the pinnacle. By and large, the picture I have just painted very briefly seemed to be the case for much of the 18th century and also the 19th century in Europe. By the mid-20th century, there was more recognition of the reality of religious difference. In Europe and North America, people of many other religions were also in large numbers. Many of them migrated to Europe and North America. This includes Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and many others. In this context, other religions, meaning other than Christianity, were no longer regarded as just folklore. The reality of globalization and religious diversity started also to be reflected in the thinking of mainstream thinkers and theologians there. From the mid to late 20th century, significant changes were taking place in Europe and North America with regards to recognition of religious diversity in a more positive manner. These developments led to the debates on religious pluralism, as we will be exploring later in this lecture. Obviously, when we discuss these developments, it is important also to look at briefly the idea of globalization and how thinking about religious diversity developed. Let us now look at globalization and religious diversity very briefly. A question that is often asked is, do we live in self-contained spaces? Well, prior to thinking about the world as predominantly defined by globalization, the territorial state was thought to be the container of society. This idea of containment, which is called the container theory of religions, assumed that state borders structured and indeed could therefore control religion and culture within these borders. A state or a territorial state with its borders was like a container that contains the culture and religion of that state. The borders of the state therefore seemed to contain what is inside them. Yet, as you might well be thinking, the idea that we live and act solely in the self enclosed spaces of our national homes seems to be an argument that is quite difficult to sustain. The availability and use of the internet and social media, for example, sit quite counter to any idea of purely nation bound identities, whether they be religious, cultural, or social. A globalized world, then, can be understood as one that is not dictated by borders, whether that is in relation to economics, information, ecology, technology, or social, cultural, and religious identifications and or relations. Looking at the world through this lens, religion and culture are not contained in the bounded landscape of nations, but they flow, change, and take influence from encounters with other forms of religion and culture in a dynamic setting. As such, the movement through systems of globalization has produced a much more dynamic picture of the world than the landscape of self enclosed nations painted by the container theory. So, globalization opens up channels, exposing us all to the religious and cultural differences that exist, of which there are so many. It may come as no surprise then as to why religious conflict in so many parts of the world continues today with great fervor. And for many, this is why the propagation of religious pluralism is so important. So, what is pluralism? Originally, pluralism was used by social scientists and did not necessarily relate to religion. Instead, it was initially used to describe circumstances in colonial situations that united groups of distinctly different ethnicities, particularly in Asian contexts. But from very early on, the term pluralism was also more generally applied to describe multi ethnic societies. Since the 1970s, the term has often been used to describe an environment where people of different faiths or religions live together peacefully while maintaining their differences. But pluralism does not just describe facts, it is also an ethic of respect that values human diversity. Pluralism rejects division as a necessary outcome of diversity, seeking instead to identify the qualities and experiences that unite rather than divide us as people, and to forge a shared stake in the public good. Here, respect for diversity transcends tolerance to embrace difference. So, what we might call the challenge of pluralism is not to obliterate or erase difference, nor to smooth out differences under a universalizing canopy, but rather to discover ways of living, connecting, relating, arguing, and disagreeing in a society of differences. This is no small challenge, given the fact that some of the most contentious differences are within religious communities and even within particular sectarian or denominational movements. A key feature of our reality today is that large numbers of people are on the move around the world as economic migrants or political refugees or as tourists or business people. This and global movements of business and technology have created increasingly diverse and complex societies. The United States, Canada, Australia, Singapore, and the nations of Europe, for example, are wrestling with new levels of religious, ethnic, and cultural diversity. We can also see that old complex cultures, such as those of India and China or Indonesia, are challenged in new ways by their own pluralities, by new global elites, by transnational mission movements, and by new articulations of nationalism. At the same time, there has been the increasing visibility and violence of many radical religious and political religious movements around the globe. Religious diversity and the religious other are critically important for us to understand today because in most parts of the world, globalization's transnational dynamic has brought religious difference close to home. The religious other is our neighbor, colleague, and friend whom we encounter on a daily basis and whose presence may positively alter our theological reflection of religious difference. A question for us is how may we respond to this religious diversity? There are a number of different ways in which we can respond to the fact of religious diversity. And these responses or approaches are called second order reflections. A number of scholars, such as Alan Race, who write on these matters, suggest that second order reflections can or have produced a typology of exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. There are, of course, a number of different responses in relation to encountering the religious other or religious diversity more generally. Here we are looking at how a person may see other religions. In that sense, these responses are more related to how one sees or approaches other religions in terms of whether other religions are true or false, or valid or invalid. Let us look at the term exclusivism. Exclusivism is the idea that there is only one true religion, and that is the exclusivist's religion. All other religions would be false. It is like saying, my religion is the only true religion and everybody else's is false. Exclusivism can be seen as a response of intolerance in some sense. What exactly are exclusivists intolerant of? Well, they may be intolerant of those who differ from them in religious belief and practice because they are convinced that they embody the true and only faith. Now let us look at inclusivism. Inclusivism, on the other hand, is thought to be a more moderate response. Inclusivism accepts that there are other religions that are regarded as holding some truth. But at the same time, this position holds that there is one religion that is more true than the others. It is like saying that my religion is the most true, and I recognize that there may be some truth in other religions. So, while the inclusivist approach offers an understanding of the value and truth of other religions to some extent, it is a very limited one because it categorizes the truth claims of different religions in a kind of hierarchy. To put it more simply, we could say that someone who approaches religious diversity from an inclusivist standpoint still privileges their own religious standpoint over any other. Now, let us look at the term pluralism. Pluralism can be understood in many ways. However, in relation to our discussion right now, pluralism can be understood as adopting the idea that all religions are true or valid. Many people might consider that pluralism is a more respectful approach to religious diversity, but this may not be that simple. So let us look at pluralism in some more detail. We will look at very briefly John Hick and his understanding of pluralism. Theorists like John Hick have attempted to construct a theory of religions that explains difference as unfolding from the same starting point. Hick calls this theory the pluralist hypothesis. According to Hick, the world's religious traditions are based on human responses to the religious ultimate, or the real, or in other words, as we know it, God. The real itself is beyond categorization, although something can be done to describe what it is not. There are also metaphorical or mythical accounts of the real, or God, and it is these accounts that form the narrative of each religious tradition, according to Hick. For him, Jews understand the real as Yahweh. Christians understand the real as God, the Father. Muslims understand the real as Allah. And a whole host of other religious traditions understand the real in their own characteristic ways. But what do you think? Does this really allow for difference in belief? Or does this reduce religious belief into too neat a system for understanding? Well, there are plenty of critics of this idea of Hick. Let me give just one example. Muhammad Legenhausen, for example, argues that Hick's theory fails to properly recognize the inherent differences of religious traditions or religions, in particular Islam. He says, and I quote, "The root of the failure of Hick's pluralism is that it makes religion into a purely human response to the divine or the ultimate reality, while Islam teaches that religion is revealed." End of the quote. Legenhausen also argues that Hick's religious pluralism is the advocacy of a forced doctrinal synthesis. It will not allow for ultimate differences in religious belief. He goes on to say that no matter how strongly the Hindu or Buddhist denies the personal nature of ultimate reality, and no matter how fervently the Christian asserts it, Hick would claim that there is no real conflict. Each simply expresses features of his or her own way to the ultimate. He argues that this fails to do justice to the lived differences and conflicts among the adherents of the world's religions. Critics of Hick's approach may argue that his approach can be coercive, or it does not allow others simply to be themselves. To play the pluralist game properly, they would argue that parties are expected to adopt quite radical reinterpretations and amendments being made to their own positions as well as those of others. Pluralism, so the argument goes, presupposes liberalism, which involves compromise, accommodation, and the dismantling of distinctive traditional convictions. Let us now look at another key figure, Diana Eck, and pluralism with a focus on people, not so much on religions. Of course, religion is important in this discussion. Diana Eck is an important theorist who addresses pluralism in the contemporary context, that is, religious pluralism in particular. She insists that pluralism is more than just tolerance of differences. She says pluralism requires knowledge of those differences and knowledge of the people. Tolerance does not require people to know anything about one another. And so tolerance can let us harbor all kinds of stereotypes and half-truths about other people. Tolerance, she argues, is definitely important, but it does little to remove our ignorance of one another. Pluralism goes well beyond tolerance, according to her, and pluralism is the process of creating a society through critical and self-critical encounter with one another. It is also about acknowledging differences rather than hiding them. And so we could say that religious pluralism is about building bridges between people of different religious traditions. It is not about eliminating the different cultures and religious worlds in which we live, but rather to connect them. And this connection would or should benefit all. So if we wanted to summarize some of Diana X's ideas, we could say the following. Pluralism is a relationship of ongoing dialogue and discussion with others. It seeks to identify the qualities and experiences that unite rather than divide us. It emphasizes individual choices as well as collective compromise and mutual obligation as routes to peace, stability, and human development. Pluralism involves dialogue, but does not assume that everyone will agree with each other. It does not involve relinquishing the distinctiveness of one's own religious tradition. It is not interested in finding a common denominator. Pluralism is, in other words, the process of creating a society through critical and self critical encounter with one another. So, in short, we could say what pluralism is not, according to her. Pluralism is not about reaching common ground. It recognizes the reality of difference. Pluralism is not about seeking to erase differences, but to discover ways of connecting, relating, and communicating. Pluralism is not about enumerating differences, it is the engagement with the difference. Pluralism is not about celebration of diversity, it involves real engagement. Finally, pluralism is not about relativism, it recognizes and respects differences. Let us look at this issue of differences in understanding what pluralism is. So, based on our discussion so far, it is possible to say that some scholars use the term pluralism with a focus on whether a religion or religions are true or valid or not. This is more about issues like validity of other religions, truth claims, and so forth. But there are other scholars who emphasize the idea that pluralism is more about respecting the differences that exist in religions or between religions, and also among people of these different religions. Here, the focus is very much on people. There are many people who use the term pluralism without making any distinction between these two usages. And this can create a lot of confusion. So it is important always to clarify what we mean by pluralism if we are using this term. So, what about Muslim responses to pluralism? In the literature on Muslims and pluralism, we find a wide range of views among Muslims on pluralism. A lot of Muslims, when they hear the term pluralism, would respond negatively in the context of religion or religious pluralism. There have been a number of fatwas. A fatwa is a Islamic legal opinion. Fatwas in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, for example, denouncing pluralism and labeling pluralism as unlawful Islamically. When we look at the details, most probably these fatwas are more about the idea that pluralism is about affirmation of the validity of all religions. In other words, what they are denouncing, in fact, is the idea that, for example, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and Hinduism, and all other religions have the same validity or truth. But as we saw in the discussion earlier, this may well be only one way of understanding pluralism. Among Muslim thinkers and scholars today, there are some who adopt the idea of pluralism as understood, for example, by someone like Hick. This is obviously not a very popular view among Muslims. In fact, it could be just a minority view. There are very few Muslim thinkers and scholars who adopt this position. We will look at some examples. Many Muslim thinkers and scholars would be more comfortable in adopting something along the lines of Diana Eck's understanding of pluralism. This is where the focus is more on recognizing the differences and respecting those differences. It's more about people, attitudes towards people, Many Muslim thinkers can find plenty of examples of supportive texts in the Quran and also in the traditions of the Prophet for this particular approach. Again, we will look at some examples. What this shows is that there is no singular Islamic or Muslim perspective on pluralism or religious pluralism. And indeed, many Muslim scholars have tried to emphasize the inherent pluralism in the sense of recognition of difference and also possibly respect for the difference that is found in Islamic tradition. Let us first look at examples of Muslim scholars who may be more sympathetic to the idea of religious pluralism as developed by, for example, Hick. The scholars we'll be looking at are very comfortable in accommodating a more inclusive view of other religions. First, let us look at Sayyid Hussein Nasr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr argues that when the Quran employs the term Islam, it is simply referring to that universal surrender to God that characterizes multiple religious traditions. For him, Islam should be understood to mean submission to God. What this means is that there may be many religions around the world which have this idea of submission to the one God. If that's the case, these religions can be considered as part of the same family of religions that are based on the divine guidance and should be considered valid. The usual examples given are often Christianity and Judaism with Islam, but others can be included too. Obviously, in Islamic theology, there are debates about validity of other religions, including those that appear to have been recognized in the Quran, for example, Judaism and Christianity. The position that was often adopted in Islamic theology is that even though there is a recognition in the Quran of some religions as being of divine origin, after the Prophet Muhammad, the only valid religion is that of Prophet Muhammad. Abdul Karim Surush is a prominent scholar who argues that the Quran makes it clear that God Himself created what he calls religious pluralism. So, in a sense, God created religious pluralism in the first place, according to him, because God sent different prophets to different people, and God knew already that the followers of different prophets would not reconcile. Their different religions are seemingly incompatible. So, for Abdul Karim Surush, the diversity of religions is the logical consequence of the diversity of religious experience and the diversity of interpretations of religious scriptures. So, all these seem to be, well, initiated by God. The third scholar we will be looking at very briefly is Abdulaziz Sachedina. He is an important Muslim scholar who has written extensively on religious pluralism. His position on religious pluralism can be summarized as follows. He says that support for pluralism can be found in the Quran. For example, chapter 2, verse 213 of the Quran affirms that humankind is one community created by God. The differences in religious traditions came about because God sent different prophets at different times to different places. Religious pluralism is therefore for him a divinely ordained system. Each religion was given its own book of revelation. But the essence of religion is simply submission to one God. He says that this is what Islam, the word Islam in Arabic means. This is how it is used in the Quran according to him, as submission to the one God. And he says that all monotheistic faiths do this, although in different ways, meaning they all submit to the one God in different ways. So, what does pluralism mean in practice for Sachedina? He says it is about being able to accommodate the beliefs of others by separating between private belief and public practice. For him, private beliefs cannot be curtailed, but public manifestations of belief can. For him, a person's public expression of belief must be guided by the principle of coexistence. And people must make effort to live together harmoniously in society while also enjoying their freedom of religion. He says that we should recognize other religious traditions as spiritual equals. Now, all these three thinkers I have briefly mentioned have some similar ideas. Well, the vast majority of Muslims may not necessarily share a lot of these ideas. Let us look at some of the arguments that are often advanced by Muslim thinkers today in support of pluralism, in the sense of respecting differences. Here we are more interested in outlining some of the key ideas that exist in Islamic tradition with regard to respecting diversity and differences in religion. Muslim thinkers often emphasize that there is plenty in the Quran to support the idea that God's message is universal, but its manifestations are plural. Far from denying the validity of its predecessor traditions, namely Judaism and Christianity, the Quran repeatedly affirms their essential truth, acknowledging that their message comes from the one and the same God, and that the Quran is only the latest of God's revelations to affirm and confirm those that preceded it. According to the Quran, revelation is also a universal phenomenon, and it says in chapter 10, verse 47, to every people was sent a messenger. Also, according to several other Quranic verses, the God of the Quran is not only the God of Muslims, but the God of all humankind. The Quran explains that God has sent messengers to every nation in order to acknowledge that every nation is responsible. The Quran also says that God gave each community a set of laws and rules, and this would be obviously different for each community. Leaving aside the Quran, the historical example of the Prophet Muhammad also reveals an ethic of pluralism. There are many instances where the Prophet showed exceeding tolerance and respect for the people of other faiths and dealt respectfully with his opponents. For instance, when a prominent Christian delegation from Najran came to engage the Prophet in a theological debate, this was in Medina, the members of the delegation were not only invited to be in the Prophet's mosque, but also allowed to perform their religious practices inside the mosque. This is despite the differences between what the Prophet was teaching and their religion, that was Christianity. We could also mention a key Quranic verse that is drawn on in international debates on the issue of freedom of religion by Muslims. Many Muslim scholars would argue that the Quran recognizes everyone's right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and that by recognizing the plurality of faith in communities, the Quran teaches us not to impose one's faith on others. Rather, it urges to tolerate the differences. There is a famous Quranic verse which is chapter 2, verse 256, which says, let there be no compulsion in religion. A lack of compulsion in religion should allow for a collective drive to understand and respect the religious other. There are many other examples that are often used in support of respect for diversity, and let me summarize them, at least some of that. The early Muslim community's positive engagement with the religious other, particularly during the period of the first caliphs or rulers after the death of Prophet Muhammad. This is seen as a very important part of the debate. The agreements these rulers or caliphs signed with many people who came under the Muslim rule emphasize those people's freedom to practice their religions freely under Muslim rule. Finally, the actual practice of engaging with the religious other in different Muslim empires or caliphates is another example. There are also a range of rules, regulations, and laws developed in various Muslim empires and states throughout history in terms of dealing with the religious other and accommodating them into the Islamic polities. We will be looking at some of these issues in later lectures. On a final note, the term pluralism seems to be a problematic term for many Muslims. Some Muslim scholars have issued fatwas against pluralism. But it seems to me that their understanding of pluralism is perhaps not the kind of pluralism many others argue for, such as Dina Ek and also a number of Muslim scholars. Pluralism for these figures is not so much about eradicating the differences between religious traditions. So, in summary, this lecture has provided some key ideas that will help us think about religious diversity and pluralism. We looked at briefly the concept of religious diversity and a range of responses to religious diversity and examples of Muslim views on religious diversity and pluralism. Thanks for watching. We hope this deepened your understanding of Islam. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series. Keep exploring. Don't forget to subscribe.